Nick Carter's world stopped the moment he saw a little girl in the rain holding a baby. He had no idea they'd change everything. It was late in the evening when Nick Carter stepped out of the towering glass building that bore his name near the top. Rain poured from the sky in sheets, soaking the pavement and streaking the sleek black cars waiting at the curb. Dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, with blonde hair neatly combed and blue eyes that rarely revealed emotion, Nick looked like the picture of control and success. His driver was running late, caught in traffic, and Nick, impatient as ever, considered walking the few blocks to his penthouse just to avoid wasting time. As he took out his phone to check the route, he caught sight of something, or rather, someone, small and still beneath the awning near the parking garage. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, sat curled up on the cold concrete, her soaked blonde hair clinging to her cheeks. She was holding something tightly in her arms, wrapped in a worn pink blanket. Her dress clung to her legs, soaked and muddy at the edges, and her thin jacket offered no protection against the rain. People passed by without stopping, without even noticing, and the girl didn't cry or call for help. She simply sat there, rocking the bundle in her arms ever so gently. Nick, who had trained himself not to be affected by the chaos of the outside world, felt something twist sharply in his chest. There was something about the way she held the baby, the way her small body shook from cold but her eyes remained steady, watching everything, that stopped him in his tracks. He walked closer, slowly, uncertain of what he was even doing. He crouched beside her, careful not to frighten her, and asked softly, "Are you all right?" The girl blinked at him, not startled, just tired. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "She's sleeping," she said, looking down at the bundle. "Her name is Bella. She's my baby sister." Nick looked at the tiny face barely visible under the blanket. The baby couldn't have been more than 8 months old. Her cheeks were pale, her breathing shallow but even. "Where are your parents?" he asked. The girl didn't answer at first. Then she said, "Mommy went to buy milk. 3 days ago." Nick felt something cold spread in his chest, sharper than the rain. He glanced around, but no one was watching. No one was coming. He offered his hand and said, "My name is Nick. You can come inside with me. It's warm. There's food. I promise I won't hurt you or your sister." She looked at him for a long moment, trying to decide if he meant what he said. Then, without a word, she shifted Bella slightly and took his hand. Her fingers were freezing. Inside the lobby of the building, the security guard looked up in surprise, but Nick gave a curt nod that told him not to ask questions. The girl didn't look around. She held Bella tightly, focused entirely on her. They rode the elevator in silence to the top floor. When the doors opened, she hesitated, then stepped inside his apartment. It was large and modern, full of glass and steel and light, but it felt impossibly empty. Nick quickly found a clean towel, a soft blanket, and a space heater. The girl sat on the couch, still holding Bella. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Emma," she said. He knelt down and said, "Emma, I'm going to help you, okay?" She nodded once. Her eyes, the same shade of blue as his, didn't look away. That night, as Emma and Bella slept in the guest room under warm covers, Nick stood in the hallway and watched the door quietly. He couldn't explain why, but he felt that this moment, this one rainy night, was the beginning of something that would change everything. The next morning arrived quietly, the city still gray from the storm that had not yet passed. Nick stood in his kitchen, a place he rarely entered, staring at the unfamiliar task of making breakfast. He wasn't sure what children liked to eat, and his fridge, normally stocked with water, black coffee, and meal-prep salads, suddenly looked empty in the face of 2 hungry little girls. He ordered groceries with a swipe of his phone and began boiling water for oatmeal, the only thing he felt confident he could make without burning down the building. Every now and then, he looked down the hallway toward the closed guest room door, listening for sounds, cries, footsteps, anything, but the silence remained unbroken. When Emma finally emerged, she did so quietly, barefoot, holding Bella in her arms. Her little sister was still asleep, her head resting against Emma's shoulder, the pink blanket now clean and warm. Emma herself had changed into one of Nick's oversized t-shirts that nearly reached her ankles. One of the maids must have helped her while he slept. She looked around uncertainly, then spotted Nick and stood very still, as if unsure if she was allowed to speak. He knelt down and smiled, the expression awkward on his usually serious face. "Good morning. Are you hungry?" Emma nodded, just once. He motioned to the table and helped her sit, placing a bowl of oatmeal in front of her with a banana sliced on top. She stared at it for a few seconds before beginning to eat slowly, carefully, still holding Bella with one arm. Nick sat across from her, not eating, just watching. Her small fingers worked with practiced grace, feeding herself and then gently offering a few soft bites to her baby sister when she stirred. It hit him then, watching her, she wasn't just a child. She was a caregiver, a protector. Whatever had happened in her short life had forced her to grow up far too fast. He leaned forward and asked gently, "Emma, do you know your mom's full name?" She hesitated. "Hannah Rose," she said finally. "She's 29. She told the hospital once, and I remembered because she said we might need it." Nick raised his eyebrows slightly. She was 6. Most 6-year-olds he knew could barely remember their own address, and yet here was this child, memorizing survival details like a soldier. He asked if she knew anyone else who might be looking for them. "No," she said. "Mom doesn't have family. We used to stay with a friend but then she moved." Her voice remained flat, matter-of-fact. Nick didn't press her. He nodded and got up to make a few calls. As she ate in silence, his home, once a fortress of solitude, began to feel alive in a new and strange way. Nick called his private security team and instructed them to begin a search for Hannah Rose. He gave them all the details Emma had offered and promised any resource they needed. He didn't explain why he was doing it. He simply said it was urgent. Then he called a pediatrician and scheduled a home visit for Bella, who still looked too pale, too quiet for a baby her age. Throughout the day, he found himself checking in more than usual. Every hour, he passed by the guest room where Emma was quietly reading from a children's book he found in storage. He offered snacks, toys, anything that might distract or comfort. She never asked for anything. She never cried. It was the quiet that disturbed him most. Not the silence of sleep, but the silence of a child who had learned the world doesn't always listen. That night, as he stood by the window overlooking the rain-soaked skyline, Nick wondered what he was getting himself into. He had built skyscrapers, salvaged bankrupt companies, won lawsuits worth millions, but nothing had prepared him for a 6-year-old who fed her baby sister before herself and stared at him like she was measuring whether he was truly safe. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he did know one thing, he wasn't going to let them go back to the street. Not now. Not ever. Emma woke up early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen, and tiptoed into the kitchen still barefoot, carrying Bella carefully in her arms. She didn't expect anyone to be awake, but she found Nick already there, standing at the stove again, trying to figure out how to make pancakes. He turned when he heard her and gave her a look that was half surprise, half relief. Without saying anything, she sat quietly at the table and began rocking Bella gently back and forth, humming something soft under her breath, a lullaby maybe, or just something she made up to keep her baby sister calm. Nick placed a small stack of slightly uneven pancakes on a plate and brought it over to her. He had found a bottle of syrup and a handful of strawberries, trying his best to make the meal feel a little less like an emergency. As she ate, he sat across from her and watched, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but like he was trying to understand something too big to say out loud. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with a napkin and looked up at him. "Are we going to stay here?" she asked plainly, with no fear in her voice, only a quiet sort of curiosity. Nick didn't answer right away. He leaned back slightly and said, "As long as you need to. Until we find your mom." And even after that, if she agrees. Emma didn't respond, but her eyes lingered on him for a few moments longer than usual before she went back to holding Bella close. Later that morning, the pediatrician arrived, a kind woman in her 50s who came with a large leather bag and a warm smile. Emma sat quietly nearby during the exam, not letting Bella out of her sight even once. The doctor confirmed that the baby was underweight but showed no signs of long-term illness. She needed rest, formula, and safety, nothing more urgent than time and care. After she left, Nick noticed the subtle way Emma relaxed just slightly, like a soldier standing down but still not putting away her armor. That afternoon, Nick had to take a few work calls, but he stayed in the apartment, using his home office. It was the first time in days he'd had to shift back into the role of CEO, but his heart wasn't fully in it. Numbers and mergers seemed so far removed from the little world unfolding just outside his door. Between calls, he stepped out and found Emma drawing with some crayons his assistant had brought over. Bella lay beside her on a soft blanket, gnawing gently on a rubber teether. The sight was so ordinary and domestic that Nick had to stop and stare for a moment, quietly stunned by how natural it all looked. That evening, while preparing dinner, this time with the help of a chef he'd hired to teach him a few basics, Nick sat down with Emma and gently asked if she'd like to tell him more about her mom. Emma hesitated at first but then spoke in soft fragments. Her mom worked long hours, didn't sleep much, but always made sure they were fed. She used to sing when she washed dishes and sometimes told Emma stories about castles and forests and magic creatures. Emma's voice wavered when she said, "She's not bad. She just got really tired. She said we were going to be okay. But then she didn't come back." Nick listened without interrupting. His instincts screamed to promise her everything would be all right, to tell her she'd never be alone again, but something in her voice made him hold back. This wasn't a girl who wanted comfort handed to her. She wanted the truth, and more than that, she wanted actions. So he simply said, "We're going to find her. I promise." That night, after putting Bella down, Emma sat on the edge of the guest bed with her knees pulled up to her chest. Nick passed by and saw her staring out the window. He knocked gently on the open door. "Can I come in?" he asked. She nodded. He sat beside her, not too close, and they watched the rain together for a while. Then, after a long silence, Emma said something he hadn't expected. "Why are you helping us?" He didn't know how to answer right away. Finally, he said, "Because someone should have helped my sister a long time ago. But no one did. And I couldn't stop what happened. I don't want to make that mistake again." Emma didn't respond, but she leaned her head on his arm for just a second before slipping back under the blanket beside her sister. As Nick turned off the light and walked back to his own room, he realized something had shifted. He wasn't just trying to protect two little girls anymore. He was beginning to care. And that, more than anything, scared him. Because once you start caring, you can't pretend it's temporary. The fourth morning in Nick Carter's penthouse began with tension humming beneath the surface, invisible but undeniable. Emma had begun to settle into the rhythm of this strange new place. She no longer flinched when someone knocked on the door or looked startled by the sound of running water. But Nick, beneath his calm exterior, was restless. Every hour that passed without a word about Hannah weighed heavily on him, not just because he had promised Emma, but because he now felt deeply responsible in a way he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just offering temporary shelter anymore. He was keeping a family from falling apart, and if he failed to find Hannah soon, he feared the damage would be permanent. While Emma colored quietly with Bella on a blanket in the sun-drenched living room, Nick paced back and forth in his office, on a call with his private investigator. The man's voice on the other end was calm but increasingly concerned. They had found traces of Hannah Rose at a diner in Queens, where she had worked part-time, and a small room she had rented on a week-to-week basis. But both leads ended cold. No friends, no bank activity, and the last anyone had seen her, she looked unwell and extremely thin. Finally, late that afternoon, the call came that would shift everything. She had been found in an alley near a bus terminal, unconscious, barely breathing, with no ID and severe signs of exhaustion and dehydration. An ambulance had taken her to a public hospital, and without a name, she had remained in a coma, unrecognized for nearly 2 days. Nick drove to the hospital himself. He didn't send a driver or a lawyer. He needed to see for himself. The ER was crowded, the walls echoing with overlapping voices, crying children, and the metallic scent of antiseptic. He hated every moment of being there, but he forced himself forward. After identifying her photo and confirming her relation to the girls, he was allowed in. The sight of Hannah Rose hit him harder than he expected. She was gaunt, her face bruised, with an IV in her arm and oxygen helping her breathe. But she was alive. The nurse told him she had suffered a minor head injury and had not regained consciousness yet. Nick stood at her bedside for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall. This woman had walked miles alone, starving, carrying the weight of 2 children and a crumbling world, and still fought to return to them. He felt both awe and anger at a system that let her fall through the cracks, and awe at her sheer strength to have made it this far. He left the hospital only after signing paperwork to cover all of her medical expenses and to ensure she would not be moved or released without his knowledge. Back at the apartment, he sat Emma down and told her gently, "We found your mom. She's alive, but she's very tired and needs to sleep for a while to get better." Emma didn't cry, but her lip trembled. She nodded slowly and whispered, "Can we see her?" Nick explained that the doctors needed a little more time, but promised she could visit as soon as it was safe. That night, Emma barely spoke. She held Bella closer than usual, and even though Nick offered to read her a story, she declined with a soft, "Not tonight." When he checked on them later, both girls were curled up together under one blanket, Bella's tiny hand holding Emma's finger. 2 days later, Hannah woke up. The first thing she asked the nurse was, "Where are my girls?" The nurse contacted Nick immediately. When he arrived, Hannah was sitting up weakly in the hospital bed, her eyes full of fear and hope. When he walked in with Emma and Bella, both clinging to his hands, she broke into tears before a single word was spoken. Emma ran to her without hesitation, careful of the wires and IVs, and climbed onto the bed, hugging her mother tightly. Bella reached out and babbled her name, and Hannah held both daughters like she would never let go again. The reunion was quiet, intense, and almost unbearably emotional. Nick stood by the door, letting them have their moment, but Hannah looked at him through her tears and said, "You saved them." He shook his head and replied, "They saved me." Later, when the girls had fallen asleep curled next to their mother, Nick sat beside her and told her everything, how he found them in the rain, what Emma had said, and what they had been through together since. Hannah listened silently, tears streaming down her face. When he finished, she said in a hoarse voice, "I didn't think anyone would care." And Nick, who had spent years behind walls of glass and steel, simply said, "I didn't think I would either. But I do. More than you know." That night, driving home alone, Nick didn't turn on the radio or check his phone. He just stared at the lights of the city as they passed by, each one reflecting some piece of the future that was slowly forming around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with business or loss or duty. It was something quieter, deeper. It was hope. And it scared him. But he didn't look away. In the days following Hannah's recovery, the rhythm of life began to change again, this time not from chaos, but from the slow, cautious process of healing. After a week in the hospital under constant care, she was discharged, still physically weak but emotionally determined. Nick brought her home himself, ignoring his schedule and calls from board members, knowing that for the first time in years, the most important thing he could do had nothing to do with contracts or corporate empires. When Hannah stepped into his penthouse, she hesitated, her hand clutching the strap of a borrowed bag, unsure if she belonged. But when she saw her daughters rush toward her with laughter and arms wide open, the uncertainty in her eyes softened. She knelt, hugging them tightly, her voice cracking as she whispered their names again and again. Nick had set up a private room for her, simple but warm, and she accepted it with quiet gratitude. Over the following days, she rested, slowly regaining strength, and began spending more time with the girls. Emma never left her side at first, afraid that if she looked away, her mother might disappear again. Nick noticed it, and though Hannah gently tried to reassure her daughter, the fear didn't vanish overnight. Bella, younger and more instinctive, simply clung to both of them, her tiny hands always reaching out for contact. Nick made a point of giving them space, but he also remained near, present in small ways, bringing tea without being asked, leaving snacks on the table, and occasionally sitting nearby without saying a word, allowing silence to be safe rather than heavy. One morning, as Hannah sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunrise, Nick joined her with 2 mugs of coffee. For a while, they didn't speak, the quiet between them no longer awkward but filled with unspoken understanding. Finally, she turned to him and said, "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head and replied, "You don't have to. I didn't do it for thanks." She looked at him closely then, really seeing him, this man who had once been just another stranger in a suit. "Then why did you do it?" she asked. He answered slowly, choosing the words carefully. "Because when I saw Emma holding Bella in the rain, I saw something I couldn't walk past. I've lived alone for a long time. Too long, maybe. And suddenly, I didn't want to anymore." Hannah said nothing in response, but the silence that followed felt like something had shifted again. That evening, when Emma asked if Nick could read them a bedtime story, Hannah didn't object. She simply sat beside him on the edge of the bed while he read from a book with slightly awkward rhythm but deep sincerity. The girls giggled at his voices, and for the first time, their laughter filled the apartment with something that sounded like real life. Later that week, Nick helped Hannah begin the process of regaining control of her own life. He arranged for legal aid to settle debts her former partner had left behind, connected her with a support group for single mothers, and even helped her find a part-time administrative job at one of his company's charitable branches, insisting it wasn't charity but a chance to start again with dignity. She resisted at first, her pride bruised, but eventually she accepted, realizing that her strength wasn't diminished by accepting help, it was amplified by it. There were setbacks. Bella came down with a fever one night, and Hannah panicked, convinced for a moment she would lose everything again. But Nick stayed up with them, holding a cool cloth to the baby's forehead and calling the pediatrician personally. Emma had a nightmare and woke up screaming, terrified her mother would vanish once more. Nick was the one who rushed in, calming her down and sitting with her until she fell asleep again, her hand tightly wrapped around his. And through it all, the 4 of them, Nick, Hannah, Emma, and Bella, began to form something no one dared call a family just yet, but it lived in the spaces between their days. It lived in the way Emma looked at him now, not with suspicion but trust. In the way Hannah began to laugh again when she wasn't looking. In the way Bella squealed with joy when she saw him enter the room. It wasn't perfect, and none of them were healed completely. But there was a foundation now, something real, something earned, not through grand gestures but through quiet persistence, shared meals, sleepless nights, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of 3 lives that had nearly been lost. Nick often stood in the hallway late at night, watching the light spilling from the guest room, listening to the sound of soft voices and occasional laughter. He no longer questioned what he was doing. He no longer saw them as a temporary interruption to his carefully constructed life. They were a part of it now. And more than that, they had given him a reason to believe in something he thought he'd forgotten how to want: home. As the weeks continued, the apartment that once echoed with silence and efficiency began to hum with something warmer and more alive. Routines formed naturally, morning breakfasts where Emma insisted on helping make toast while Hannah prepared bottles for Bella, afternoons spent with Emma drawing at the dining room table while Hannah worked on training modules Nick had arranged for her new job, and quiet evenings where the 4 of them often found themselves watching movies curled on the same oversized couch. It wasn't planned, and it certainly wasn't something Nick had expected to want, but every small habit they built together felt like the threads of something permanent weaving quietly into place. Nick started rearranging his schedule without even realizing it. Meetings were moved earlier or held remotely, and his evenings, once reserved for solo dinners or late work, were now filled with little voices, spilled juice, and Hannah's exhausted but grateful smiles. He didn't miss his old life, not even the perfectly structured solitude that had once made him feel secure. Instead, he began to measure his days by things like whether Bella had smiled or if Emma had asked him to read her another chapter before bed. One Saturday afternoon, a moment came that shook the fragile peace they had built. Hannah had gone to a parent workshop, encouraged by Nick and organized through the company's community program. She left the girls in his care, something that might have terrified her weeks ago, but now she trusted him. Everything was going smoothly until the doorbell rang. Nick opened it, expecting a delivery, but instead found himself face to face with a man in his early 30s, unshaven and unsteady, asking for Hannah. His voice was too casual, but his eyes flickered with something darker, agitation, maybe desperation. Nick stepped outside and shut the door behind him. "Who are you?" he asked. The man introduced himself as Jacob, Hannah's ex. Nick's instincts immediately went cold. Jacob didn't ask about the girls. He didn't even seem to care where they were. Instead, he hinted at debts Hannah might still owe, mentioned how she had run off and left things unresolved. Nick told him firmly that Hannah and the children were safe, and anything he had to say could go through a lawyer. Jacob laughed, but there was no humor in it. Before leaving, he muttered something about seeing them again soon, and Nick knew that this wasn't over. He didn't tell Hannah right away, but he instructed his security team to add surveillance to the building's entrance and assigned a guard to discreetly monitor the lobby. The next day, when Hannah returned and noticed the subtle changes, she asked what had happened. Nick hesitated, but then told her everything. Her face went pale, and she immediately went to check on the girls. When she returned, her voice was steady but low. "I knew he'd come back. He always does." Nick asked her if she wanted to press charges or file a restraining order. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "I do. But I don't want to run anymore. I want to fight back. For them." Nick supported her through the entire process. The legal team filed papers, a court hearing was scheduled, and Hannah, though anxious, stood tall when the day came. Nick was in the courtroom with her, sitting silently in the back row as she testified. Jacob tried to manipulate the situation, but the evidence, the hospital records, and Hannah's testimony were enough. The judge granted full protection orders and officially acknowledged Nick as a temporary guardian for the girls, given his role in their care. It was a legal step, but for Emma and Bella, it was just a confirmation of something they already knew, that Nick was someone who wouldn't leave. After the hearing, Hannah collapsed into Nick's arms in the parking lot, not in fear but in relief. "I never thought I'd win," she whispered. "You didn't have to," he said softly. "You just had to survive long enough to try." That night, Emma made a drawing of their family. It showed a tall blonde man in a suit, a woman with brown hair, a baby in a pink dress, and a girl in a white dress with a sun above them and the word "home" written in shaky letters across the top. She handed it to Nick without a word and walked off to play. He stared at the paper for a long time, then framed it quietly and placed it on his desk beside the awards and corporate milestones. For the first time in his life, a child's crayon sketch felt like the most valuable thing he owned. As autumn crept into the city with cooler mornings and golden trees lining the avenues, something settled into place between the four of them that neither Nick nor Hannah had words for yet. It wasn't about titles or declarations, it was in the way Emma reached for Nick's hand when crossing the street or how Bella toddled toward him first when he entered the room after work. It was in the ease of shared silence at the dinner table, the comfort in their mismatched routines, and the steady, healing rhythm of their new life together. Still, despite all the progress, the weight of the past hadn't entirely let go. One morning, Nick found Hannah standing by the window with a distant look in her eyes, her fingers clutched around the strap of her shoulder bag. When he asked her what was wrong, she hesitated before saying she had received a letter from the shelter she once stayed in. It had information about her own mother, a woman she hadn't seen since she was 16. The name alone stirred memories she hadn't let herself feel in years. Hannah explained that her mother had abandoned her when she became pregnant with Emma. The pain of that rejection had followed her through every moment of raising her daughters alone. But now, apparently, the woman wanted to meet. Nick listened without judgment, offering only presence. When Hannah asked him what she should do, he didn't offer advice. He just said, "You already survived her once. Now you decide what's best for you and the girls." After a long pause, she folded the letter and quietly said, "I don't think I need her anymore. I just needed to know she remembered I existed." That same week, Nick had his own reckoning. His estranged father, whom he hadn't seen in over a decade, showed up at a corporate event where Nick had been scheduled to speak. They exchanged few words, mostly formal, empty pleasantries, but the encounter rattled him. His father had walked away from the family after the loss of Nick's sister, drowning himself in money, remarriage, and silence. For years, Nick had convinced himself he didn't care. But after the event, he returned home, poured himself a drink, and sat alone on the balcony until Hannah joined him. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat beside him with a blanket and said, "Some ghosts don't deserve closure. Let them stay ghosts." He looked at her then, realizing she was the first person who had ever seen the parts of him he tried to hide and stayed anyway. Meanwhile, Emma had started school, and though she struggled at first to adjust to structure and peers, her teachers noted how fiercely protective she was of others. One day she was sent home for punching a boy who mocked another student's torn backpack. When Nick asked her why, she said, "No one helped me when my things were dirty. I'm not going to let that happen to anyone else." He didn't punish her. He just talked to her, praised her for her heart, and reminded her there were other ways to be brave. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Nick and Hannah stayed up talking. Their conversation drifted from books to music to childhood memories, and somewhere between laughter and the occasional shared silence, something shifted again. Hannah looked at him and said, "You don't scare me anymore." Nick smiled a little, not teasing, but with genuine warmth. "I think that might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." Then she leaned in and kissed him, tentative at first, then with the quiet certainty of someone who had waited too long to trust again. It wasn't dramatic or passionate in a movie sense. It was real. Earned. Heavy with everything unspoken and finally safe to feel. After that night, nothing changed outwardly. No announcements were made. The children didn't need explanations, they already knew. But there was a softness between Nick and Hannah now, a language only they understood. She no longer felt like a guest in his home, and he no longer viewed his space as something he needed to protect from vulnerability. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And yet, as happy as things were becoming, Nick couldn't stop the thought that maybe none of this was supposed to happen. That by sheer accident, a walk in the rain, a moment of hesitation, a girl holding a baby, he had found everything he didn't know he was looking for. It frightened him because it felt fragile. But it also filled him with something that had been absent from his life far too long, the courage to believe it could last. By the time winter painted the city in frost and lights, the penthouse no longer felt like a place of quiet power and polished emptiness. It felt like home. There were fingerprints on the windows, shoes scattered by the front door, half-finished crayon drawings taped to the fridge, and laughter echoing down hallways that had once known only silence. The transformation had not come from renovations or design, it had come from people, from life, from a little girl who had stood in the rain clutching her baby sister and from a man who had, for once, listened to something deeper than logic. Nick no longer watched life from the outside. He had grown used to chaos in the form of spilled juice, toddler shrieks, and bedtime negotiations. He had memorized the rhythm of Bella's sleepy hums and the exact way Emma liked her sandwich cut. He took meetings with a stuffed animal occasionally perched on his shoulder and kept a tiny bracelet Emma had made him wrapped around the base of his expensive watch. And as for Hannah, she was no longer someone he had rescued. She was someone he relied on, someone whose presence steadied him in ways he hadn't known he needed. Her laughter had returned. Not the cautious smile she wore in the early days, but real, open laughter that filled rooms and made Nick pause mid-call just to listen. On Christmas morning, they didn't exchange grand gifts. Instead, they made pancakes in their pajamas, Emma insisting on stirring the batter while Nick managed not to burn them. Bella wore a sparkly crown she refused to take off, and Hannah read aloud from a book of winter stories while the snow fell gently outside. At one point, Emma tugged on Nick's sleeve and handed him a small wrapped box. Inside was a paper heart she had cut herself, with the word family written in the center in big, shaky letters. Nick didn't say anything at first. He just hugged her tighter than she expected and didn't let go for a long time. Later that day, while the girls napped under a shared blanket and soft music played in the background, Nick and Hannah sat together on the couch, watching the snow fall. She reached for his hand without a word, and he laced his fingers through hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. They talked about the future, not in vague what-ifs but in real, concrete terms. Schools. Apartments. Maybe even a house. They didn't have all the answers, but they had time now, and more importantly, they had each other. At some point, Hannah leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "I used to think survival was all I could ask for. Just making it through the day. But now, I think maybe we're allowed more than that. Maybe we're allowed to dream." Nick looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're not surviving anymore," he said. "You're living. We all are." That night, after the lights were dimmed and the world outside was still, Nick stood in the hallway again, watching the soft glow of the nightlight in the girls' room. Emma was asleep, one arm draped protectively over Bella. He walked quietly to his office, now filled with toys, drawings, and a photo of the four of them from the fall, unposed, slightly out of focus, but full of joy. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and drafted a new letter of resignation from the boardroom role he had once believed defined him. He wasn't leaving everything behind. Just the part that had kept him cold and distant from what truly mattered. The next morning, when Hannah found the letter, she didn't ask questions. She just looked at him, understanding written across her face, and said, "So what happens now?" Nick smiled. "Now we build something better. Together." In the end, it wasn't about a rescue. It wasn't even about a miracle. It was about the ordinary magic that comes when broken people choose each other, when fear gives way to trust, and when home becomes not a place, but the people who make you feel whole. And for Nick, Hannah, Emma, and Bella, that was more than enough. It was everything. To me, the ending of this story is not just heartwarming, it's powerful in its quiet honesty. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or fantasy-like resolutions. Instead, it shows that real transformation happens in small, consistent acts of love and trust. What began as an unlikely meeting on a rainy street turned into a story of healing for everyone involved. Nick didn't just save Emma and Bella, they saved him too, pulling him out of emotional isolation and showing him the kind of life that can't be bought or built in boardrooms. Hannah's journey from survival to stability reflects the strength of women who endure unthinkable challenges for the sake of their children. And Nick's shift from a lonely, guarded executive to a man willing to redefine his life around a new kind of purpose, that's the kind of character arc that stays with you. The best part? It's a love story, yes, but not just romantic. It's a love story about family, about belonging, and about how sometimes, the people we're meant to find are the ones we never expected to need.